I've been a home renovations contractor here in the great state of Texas for coming up on 35 years now. And in that time, I've worked on some incredible homes and met some incredible people too. But I've also worked one or two jobs that have come to haunt me, and this is the story of one such job. In March of 1994, I got a call from a guy who'd just purchased a falling down home near Laredo Ranchettes, about 6 miles outside of Laredo. He said I'd need to stabilize the foundations, shore up the framing, and swap out any rotting beams or walls to align with state building codes. The roof needed reshingling, all the doors and windows would need resealing, and the whole place needed a massive utilities overhaul, including an HVAC replacement. Inside, I'd need to insulate the walls and attic, refinish the wooden floors, make sure all the bathroom fixtures were in good working order, and all after securing the right permits from the county courthouse. And all in all, it was looking like a 3 to 6 month job that had set the owner back between $50,000 and $100,000 or possibly more. And so as you can imagine, I accepted the contract pretty much there and then and signed it after 2 quick read-throughs to make sure everything was up to code. Now, I drove out to the place on a Monday morning, having signed the contract and received the keys on the Friday before. It was a big job, so I was pretty excited to get started, but when I arrived, I found out that my key didn't work. Now, I think I just rolled my eyes, then took out my phone to give him a call, but since it was pretty early in the morning, I was neither surprised nor annoyed when he didn't answer. I left a message on his voicemail asking him to call me back because he'd given me the wrong key. I wasn't rude about it, I just said it like it was, and how I'd appreciate if he could get me the real key as soon as humanly possible. Now, being there wasn't a complete waste of time because I could still survey the building's exterior and get a real feel for what I was dealing with. So for about the next half hour or so, that's what I did. Right up until a black SUV came tearing up the road behind me, and a guy dressed in a security uniform got out of it. He asked if I had permission to be on the land, so I explained who I was and why I was there. Now, once I explained I was the contractor, he softened up a little, but went on to explain how I couldn't be there just yet because the safety inspectors hadn't been around yet. Now, I thought I was doing the safety evaluation, but he went back to his truck to grab the paperwork for me. And then, since it all looked legitimate, with the name of the owner on there and everything, I got back in my truck and drove back into town. Now, I was having lunch by the time the client called me back, and while I figured it'd be a simple case of getting me the right key, it was anything but. He sounded annoyed when I picked up the phone and insisted that he had indeed given me the correct key. Now, I very calmly assured him that wasn't the case, but it was easily rectified, especially since he had a whole week before the safety inspectors could finish their work. Now, the client immediately says, "What safety inspectors?" And so I explained the whole encounter with a security guard that he'd hired. And once again, the client immediately responded with, "What security guard?" And this was when I realized something weird was going on. I told the client as much, and how from experience there was probably some kind of illegal activity occurring in his vacant property. He sighed, then asked if I could meet him out at the house the following morning with a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. The next morning, I did the same thing as the first and arrived at the vacant house around 8 a.m. And then over the next 10 to 20 minutes, the client, the locksmith, and the deputy rolled up one by one. The client goes over the situation with the deputy and the locksmith, just making sure that they're up to speed about what he might be facing inside. Then, once that was all out of the way, the locksmith got the door open and the deputy let us inside. And the first thing that struck me was how clean the place was. It was still run down, and I could see a bunch of junk and old dusty furniture in one of the rooms, but the hallway looked like it had been swept meticulously, as did one of 4 rooms on the ground floor. But when the deputy walked into that room, he saw something that had him calling it in on his radio just a few seconds later. It was a chair, a metal one, and it looked like it had been bolted to the floor. It wasn't alone either. There was a bunch of chains piled up in one corner, and the deputy mentioned that too when he made his dispatch call. It was obvious that something bad had been happening there. Something really bad by the looks of things. We just didn't understand the extent of it, not until we got upstairs and saw what had been done to the shower cubicle. Now, the bathtub was in one corner, and the shower was in the other, and much like the hallway and the room downstairs, it looked like someone had taken a great amount of care in cleaning the place down. But that's not what stopped me in my tracks. What had my mouth open in shock and horror was the fact that someone had reinforced the shower cubicle with concrete slabs, and these concrete slabs looked like they had bullet holes in them. Not all the way through bullet holes, but almost like damage where bullets had hit the concrete. And as soon as he saw that, the deputy told us that we better go back outside because the place was almost certainly now some kind of crime scene. We just did as he asked and walked back outside in silence, and with this chill in the air despite that Texas heat. We knew we'd just been someplace where folks had been hurt and then killed, and there was no telling just how many folks that had happened to either. And it all made sense why the place was so clean too, at least the rooms people were using for their business there, and why they'd most likely been scrubbed down during the previous 24 hours following my first visit to the place. Now there was a real sense of they were just here, which only added to how damned creepy it all was, and I'll never forget the look on that deputy's face either, like he'd never seen anything like that before. The poor guy figured he was going to chase out some squatters and ended up walking around a freaking torture and execution chamber. And as you can probably guess, renovations were delayed until the cops could comb the house over for any evidence. But they didn't find a lick of it inside those four walls, and they didn't find anything around the property either, especially digging the place up so much that it looked like the surface of the moon. Just craters everywhere. I obviously wasn't told crap by the cops, I was just the contractor, but when it came time for the job to start back up again, the client filled me in on what they told him. And like I said, the cops didn't find anything. But based on how clean the place was in relation to how run down the home was, it was likely the house had been occupied during my first visit, and when I tried to unlock the door, there had been torturers and murderers inside, and maybe even victims too. And that gave me a whole second helping of all that creepy, they were just here feeling. Only as you can imagine, it was way worse that time thinking that I'd been so close to such terrible evil, and it had been quietly lurking inside, while I'd been completely none the wiser. As a younger man, I was a Texas Ranger for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time, I saw and heard things that would quite literally haunt a man until he's lying in his grave. But out of all of those things, there's only one that haunts me more than most, and that creeps into my mind on those cold and lonely nights when I wonder if I ever really made a true difference. It was the early 80s, I was a much younger man, and I was essentially working as an understudy to a veteran ranger who had a heck of a lot of wisdom to impart to me. Then one day, we were asked to go visit a guy named Wolf, Paul Wolf, to ask him about his wife's ex-husband. A Mr. Billy Staton and his current partner had been missing for a few days, having apparently last been seen paying a visit to Mr. Wolf's house. Mr. Wolf was by that time married to Mr. Staton's ex-wife and had shared custody of Staton's daughter, Melody. He also didn't think her father treated her very well, most likely on account of his wife talking trash about him when he wasn't around. Wolf would sometimes become aggressive with Billy Staton whenever he showed up to pick up his daughter, sometimes very aggressive. And so Mr. Staton decided that he's going to slip a small tape recorder into his pocket prior to pickup so he can prove to a judge just how hostile Wolf really was. Now, when we arrived at Wolf's home, he claimed no knowledge of Staton's visit. He said Staton and his fiancée, a lady named Letitia Castro, hadn't been by in almost a week, and since they hadn't stopped by to exchange custody, they just kept hold of little Melanie until they decided to show. Now, we knew that wasn't the case, so we knew that we caught him in a lie, and that was all the grounds we needed to arrest him on suspicion of murder. And then, surprise, surprise, once he was in custody, Mr. Wolf changed his tune and admitted that Staton and Castro had stopped by his place. He started claiming that upon trying to remove his daughter from the property, Staton became forceful and started yelling at her. Wolf said he stepped in and tried to calm Staton down, but Staton began yelling and shoving him away. A fight broke out, But while Wolf was merely trying to restrain the angry Staten, Staten was straight up trying to murder him. Wolf said he tried, and he tried, yelling for his wife, Staten's ex, to call the cops, but Staten overpowered him and forced him to escalate. Wolf said that in order to save his own life, his wife's life, and the life of her daughter, he began striking Mr. Staten around the head with an iron bar. Now, he said he blacked out, like the red mist had descended on him, and then when he woke up, Mr. Staten and his fiancée were dead. Wolf said that in a panic, he threw the two bodies into the back of his truck and then drove out to a nearby river to dump them. He told us where the spot was, so we drove out to see if he was telling the truth. It turns out the bodies were exactly where he said they'd be, bloated and half rotten from laying there in lukewarm river water. But I guess Wolf was counting on the bodies being too rotten to really analyze, because when we found them, Miss Castro's corpse showed that she'd been shot in the head at close range and was something of a large caliber. Now, this directly contradicted Wolf's story, as he insisted only the metal bar was used to defend himself and his family. But that wasn't the only thing that proved Wolf was lying, because when we dragged Billy Staten's body out of the water, we found something hidden on his person. A small tape recorder with a tape still inside it. And since restoring that kind of tech was way beyond our capabilities, we sent the tape over to the FBI lab in Washington to see if they could pull anything off of it. The tape was actually moldy at the time, and you'd think that we'd have dried it out and cleaned it off before sending it, but according to the folks over at the lab, drying it out was the worst thing that we could do to it. And we ended up mailing it to them in a little plastic jar of water, and then a couple of weeks later, they mailed us back a fully working copy of the original. And the audio wasn't exactly crystal clear, but it was clear enough to make out individual voices, as well as what they were saying, and what they were saying contradicted Paul Wolf's entire story. Now, right away, we could tell his story had been a bold-faced lie, almost right from the jump. It's possible to hear Mr. Staten asking his daughter to come with him, at which point she began to cry. Now, we figured this lined up with what Wolf had said about Staten being such a poor father that his daughter dreaded being in his company. But as she cried, he wasn't angry or aggressive with her. He merely attempted to calm and console what sounded like a tired and cranky kid. Yet as Mr. Staten tried to calm his daughter, it was Wolf who became aggressive, and then after what sounded like a brief struggle, a series of very deep thumps can be heard. The next you hear is that Mrs. Wolf, Billy Staten's ex, who begins yelling, "Get him! Hurry up and get him!" Mrs. Wolf then yells, "Hit him again," and then the front door. And that last part was in reference to the fact that Miss Castro was trying to escape. Somebody ran to block the door, and then Miss Castro's life was ended too. Mrs. Wolf then begins yelling, "Get him up! Get him out of here!" At which point Mr. Wolf enlisted the help of one Glenn Henderson, who later confessed to his part in disposing of the bodies and was sentenced to life in prison. Sometime later, apparently during the cleanup process, Paul Wolf can be heard saying, "Ah, damn it, Glenn, look at the mess you made." And we later found out that Mr. Henderson had failed to actually wrap one set of remains, and while lifting up to carry it out of the house, a large amount of blood leaked onto the hallway carpet. And this ended up being a crucial piece of evidence even after the Wolves hired an industrial-grade vacuum cleaner to try and get rid of it, and we ended up putting both Paul Wolf and his wife away for a very long time. Now, during my time in the Rangers, I came to witness a lot of very disturbing crime scenes, but we get there when it's all over and the dust has settled. We occasionally watched pieces of security camera footage, and I understand that these days they come with sound and color, but back then, it was all black and white and grainy, and it ran like a silent movie. I realized that I'd seen a lot of dead people, and I'd seen quite a number receive fatal injuries. I just never heard anyone die before. So the sound Billy Staten made on the tell-all recording, that groan that he let out as his skull was being caved in, I think it might haunt me for the rest of my natural life. I was raised in West Texas, a trailer park by a single mom, and the rest is summed up by a couple of lines from a Merle Haggard song. Dear old daddy, rest his soul, left my mom a heavy load. She tried so very hard to fill his shoes, working hours without rest, wanted me to have the best. She tried to raise me right, but I refused. People said my daddy was wild, and I guess I sprung from that same bad seed. But while my buddies were picking poisons like dope or booze or women, I got hooked on something altogether different. Adrenaline. I was a junkie for it ever since I stood up to my middle school bully. He beat 7 shades of crap out of me, but I landed the sweetest right hook right on his fat face before he did, and afterwards, I felt so good I could have strut sitting down. He didn't bother me anymore after that, and I didn't see enough high school for anyone else to make the same mistake. But when I heard my little cousin was being hassled at high school, I just about jumped at the chance to trim some tail feathers, so to speak. And that, ladies and germs, was the first time I robbed anybody. My freshman cousin had a toy cap gun shaped like a pearl handle revolver, and it was his pride and joy, but I guess it was his own damn fault for taking a toy into high school because he got it snatched off of him almost right away. He kept his trap shut about it for weeks, so by the time I found out, there was no getting the cap gun back. But when I found the bully, I made him empty his pockets, I took his sneakers, and I even took the shirt off his damn back. And that was an even bigger rush than socking my bully in his fat, pudgy face. And I guess that was my career decider right there. The way other kids see a Marine in his dress blues or a roughneck manhandling his rig and think, damn, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I robbed that kid and I thought, hell, I could get used to this. And I started off in earnest when I was 16, stealing cars and robbing houses so I wouldn't have to get a real job. And then by the time I started hanging out in bars and meeting the right people, I got involved in much more organized sorts of crime. I started robbing trucks with a guy who called himself TJ because all we had to do was wait to see which truckers picked up a lot lizard and then raid their cargo when the cab was shaking. And that made us some good money for a while, but as we got older and started racking up bills, we needed to graduate to something a little more rewarding. We started robbing gas stations, bars, and pawn shops, anything that would net us a clean 4 or 5 figures if we hit the safe on deposit day. And then as we started hitting bigger and bigger places, we brought on a guy called Jody for crowd control. Now this was my crew for about 3 years, and we'd hit a place maybe once every couple of months if conditions were just right. But then for this one job of robbing a small credit union, Jody wasn't available, and after shopping around, TJ said that he'd found a replacement in the form of a guy named Vincent. Before we did anything with Vincent, I wanted a face-to-face, and so we met for some steak and potatoes over at this little place outside of Odessa. And TJ said that he was a big guy, pretty sharp too, meaning that he'd be the perfect replacement for Jody while he was out of state. And then when he walked through the door of that steak place, I couldn't have agreed more. The guy was terrifying, not just because of how big he was, and he had to be scraping at least 7 feet with his boots on, but because of the way he carried himself, like he was meaner than a skillet full of rattlesnakes. I'm not easy to frighten, but having Vincent sitting across from me with his long and wild-looking beard, it had me feeling like Dobby in a glue trap. He had this way of looking at you that felt like he was peeking right into your head, just sort of quietly figuring you out. Vincent said he had some military experience, just not with the U.S. military, and that he had connections in the Aryan nations after doing a little time over in New Mexico. He didn't have a problem working in a crew, and he didn't mind doing things our way if we organized the job right. And the only thing that struck me as sketchy was when he said that he couldn't talk about the time that he served in that other country's military. That kind of set off my bullcrap detector, but if all we needed him to do was stand there and look mean, then he'd be just fine. We ended up hitting this little credit union about a week later, and unlike a lot of the bigger unions or bank chains, the manager proved a tough nut to crack. A teller in a big bank chain is just there to collect a paycheck, but a small-town credit union manager, that's his whole life that you're stamping on. He knows his customers, they're his neighbors, and he likes them too. But what he doesn't like is no-account robbers like us thinking that we can have something for nothing. A small-town credit union manager might think twice, maybe even 3 times before handing over the keys or codes, and in a profession like mine, seconds meant safety, and the more you racked up during that crucial part of a job, the more danger of getting busted there was. And the one at the job that I'm talking about was no different. It was my job to get him to hand over the keys while TJ and Vincent watched the door and worked crowd control, and right away, just from the look in the manager's eyes, I knew that he wasn't going to play ball. I ended up bashing him over the head with my pistol a few times just to show that I was serious. I can't say that I'm altogether proud of that, but like I said, seconds mean safety. He took one hit, and then another, and he still didn't break. I was getting worried that he might not break at all until Vincent pointed at one of the two tellers working at the place and asked if she was the man's daughter. No, the manager was a lily-white Texan, while the teller looked like her parents came from Mexico or maybe further south. So when Vincent first suggested that she was the manager's daughter, I thought to myself, what are you smoking? But when I turned back to the manager, he had this look of pure terror in his eyes. Vincent smiled, jumped over the counter, and then started tearing at the buttons on the girl's blouse, saying that he was going to do all this obscene stuff to her right in front of her dad. The manager just about lost his mind and promised to hand over the keys if Vincent promised not to touch her. And that was all it took, and we were out of there with a whole bunch of cash just a few minutes later. I later asked Vincent if he was serious, if he really would have done all those things that he talked about to make the manager hand over the keys. Now he just smiled that big wolfish smile of his and said, "Whatever it takes to get the job done, brother. Whatever it takes." Now I had no doubt in my mind that he meant what he said, and I don't think I've ever met anyone who was so obviously a dyed-in-the-wool psycho. But little did I know, I hadn't seen nothing yet. The next job we did with Vincent, we hit up a little savings bank just outside of San Antonio. One of the Mexican supervisors, who we needed to open up the safety deposit boxes, had some kind of meltdown and forgot all of her English. Maybe she did it on purpose to slow us down, or maybe it was genuine, who knows. But what I do know is that out of nowhere, Vincent steps up and starts straight up speaking fluent Spanish to her. Now he's not just talking Spanish either, he's talking to this chick like he's her damned uncle or something, trying to almost soothe and relax her. And you know something? It worked. She freezes up, stops screeching like a whistle, and then just looks at him as he gives his little speech. And then when he's done, she hands over the keys to the boxes, and once again, we're making our getaway in minutes flat. We all wanted to know what he said to that lady, but Vincent calmly explained that all he did was tell her what would happen if she didn't hand over those keys. That San Antonio bank job was the last we saw of Vincent for a little while. He said he had some business out of state, but that he was working on something in the meantime, and he'd let us know if he could use our help. Now, we said we appreciated him keeping us in mind, but to be honest, we were more than happy to go our separate ways. Vincent got the job done all right, but at the same time, he felt like a liability, like it was only going to be a matter of time before he did something terrible. Like what he said he was fixing to do to that guy's daughter right there in front of him. And maybe 9 months later, TJ gets a call from Vincent about that job that he said he was casing. I was in TJ's place when he got the call, and the second he said, "Oh, hey Vincent, how's your mom and them?" I got to rolling my eyes thinking, "Ah, crap, here we go again." Now there came a point in the conversation when TJ started sounding a little skeptical, saying stuff like, "I don't know, Vincent, sounds like a lot." But then Vincent said something to him, something I didn't hear, which made him look like Jesus Christ himself had just talked down that phone to him. Now his eyes went very wide and his jaw dropped a little, and he stayed very quiet for a long time before setting up a meeting. And I remember driving out to the diner with TJ and trying to figure out what was going on. You know, he kept saying stuff like, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," or "You're better off hearing it from the horse's mouth." He also said if he told me what Vincent had in mind, I'd probably duck and roll out of the car, and that's when I asked him to at least tell me what kind of job they'd talked about. TJ kept his eyes on the road but told me, "The last one before we retire." And after that, it was my turn to stay quiet and just stew in the mystery until we got to the diner. And when we got there, Vincent was leaning over this big plate of steak and eggs, eating it like he hadn't in weeks. And we asked him where he'd been, and he tells us, Mexico. and then explains how he's been eyeing up the score of a goddamn lifetime, just like TJ said. He'd been tracking these cash couriers south of the border for weeks, casing their routes, figuring out their schedules, and then putting together enough firepower to make the job doable. I asked him what kind of firepower we needed, if all we wanted to do was scare a couple of couriers, but he said to do that, we needed something that'd pierce armor. The golden rule of armed robbery is to not kill anyone, because then you're a murderer and the cops will hunt you like one. We don't use armored piercing anything because the best jobs are the kind where bullets don't get fired, and so when Vincent mentioned armor piercing, my ass was halfway out the door. But then he started talking about how to get the couriers to stop, we needed to at least demonstrate that we could pierce the armor on their trucks, and without that, they'd just roll through the ambush without stopping and they'd get away. Now, I guess I had it in my head that this was a regular job, and when I say regular, I mean your standard armored car job. So when Vincent said that the couriers were carrying some cash illegally across the border and were doing it for the Sinaloa cartel, I thought he'd lost his damned mind. Now, I feel like just about everyone in America knows who the cartel are these days, but the Sinaloa stand tall even among their fellow narcos. They're one of the oldest in Mexico, and at the time, they were by far the most powerful, too. They were led by the El Chapo guy for a while, and they don't mess around when it comes to protecting their operations. And so when Vincent suggested we rob them, I figured it'd be quicker to just shoot each other in the face right there and then, because if we robbed the cartel, that's how we were going to end up, dead as buzzard bait. But Vincent said he had a plan. At the time, the Sinaloa cartel was at war with the Juarez cartel. Couriers were getting robbed and their hitmen were dying by the dozen, but it was all just one big mess down there. But that meant, at least according to Vincent, that the Sinaloa wouldn't suspect a foursome of gringos to be responsible for robbing one of the couriers, at least not unless directed by their enemies in Juarez. And to him, it was foolproof, and if we did the job right, we could bring home enough laundered cash to retire on. We wouldn't have to worry about washing it. We wouldn't have to worry about anyone coming after us. All we'd have to do is figure out what kind of porch swing we wanted to sit our asses down on until we were old enough to die, and figure out which kind of beer we wanted to drink while we were doing it. I didn't realize how much I wanted out until I saw the crack in the door, and I guess it was the same for TJ and Jody too, because after thinking on it for all of 30 seconds, we decided to go for it. About a week later, we all met up with Vincent just before midnight for the long-ass drive down to the ambush site. Vincent's plan was relatively simple. At dawn, when the couriers approached our position in their 2 trucks, we'd pull up a heavy chain across the dirt road, kill their engines with our armor-piercing bullets, and then keep on shooting until any guards were dead and the drivers surrendered. When I asked him how he was so sure the drivers would just surrender, Vincent said that they were just that. Drivers. They'd give themselves up once they realized that they were in trouble. Now I started getting doubts because if those drivers lost all that cash, the cartel weren't going to just slap them on the back and say, "Better luck next time, hombre." They'd torture those guys first just to make sure that they weren't in on the scam. And then even if they weren't, they'd carve them up and hang them from a bridge just to make an example out of them. And the more I thought about it, the more I got this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. But even when that feeling got so intense I wanted to puke, I'd push it back down again and tell myself, get this right, and you're home free. No more jobs, no more Vincent, no more worrying about anything ever again. And it was that which kept my mouth shut during that drive across the border. It was still dark as we set up, tying the chain to a tree before covering it with a thin layer of dirt. We dug little holes too on a low rise near the road, with one a little closer than the others so whoever was in it could pull the chain up and block the couriers. And after that, it was just a case of waiting and watching and hoping those couriers didn't decide to rearrange their run at the last minute. Now we waited hours, watching the sun get higher and higher and feeling the air get warmer. Now Vincent said the trucks would roll by about an hour after dawn. But then 2 hours had gone by and there wasn't a truck to be seen, and I started to doubt that they were ever going to show up at all. Now by around 8 a.m. we were all sweating buckets, barely able to hear our own thoughts above all the noise that the cicadas were making. But then after maybe an hour of sweat and frustration, I remember seeing this glint of light on the horizon as 2 white trucks came into view. We started hooping and hollering a little, having sat in those dusty holes for so damn long, and Vincent told us to shut the hell up and be ready. Now, as we watched the trucks getting closer and closer, TJ took hold of the chain, waiting for Vincent's signal to start yanking it up into the roadway. But when it came, and TJ forced those trucks to hard brake as it rose up, Vincent didn't aim for the engine blocks. He aimed right for the truck's tinted windows, and then unleashed hell. Someone in the second truck managed to get a few shots off, but Jody was ready with his AK, and it was pure chaos, but it was over in seconds. So quick that me and TJ didn't even get time to fire a shot, and then once the smoke had cleared and everything went quiet again except for the groans of the dying couriers, we made our move. As we ran towards the trucks, I remember TJ yelling about Vincent not having to shoot everyone. Vincent said what's done is done, and he should shut his mouth and get to work. TJ had only just unlocked the second truck's storage, and we were about to go rummaging around in the back when we suddenly heard the sound of a child crying. In a way that only a kid's cry can grab your attention like that, me and TJ ended up spinning around on the spot to see where the voices were coming from. I remember seeing Jody, wide-eyed, looking into the truck in front, and then seeing Vincent open up one of the back doors and start speaking in Spanish. TJ had a daughter who stayed with his mom, so realizing that there had been kids in that lead truck just about sent him off the handle. He marched over to where Vincent was speaking Spanish to them and asked what he was doing. Vincent said he was telling them to stay in the trucks because someone would be coming by to get them before long. TJ didn't like that one bit on account of we all know what happens to kids or dogs when they're locked in hot cars. Him and Vincent went at it for about a minute, going back and forth about how those kids needed to be safe, and Vincent thought about it for a moment and then said we could just drop them off at a gas station or something once we got back on American soil. TJ didn't much like that idea either, but just like the whole surrendering drivers thing, I don't think Vincent was ever really planning on doing what he said. Because as me and Jody are hauling a big bag of cash back towards the place we'd hidden our own truck, we heard 2 gunshots and then the sound of TJ screaming. We dropped the bag of cash where we were and then ran back to see what was going on. I thought TJ might have gotten himself shot, possibly by a courier who wasn't dead as we thought he was. But when we got to the top of that rise and we saw why TJ was still screaming at Vincent and calling him all the curse words under the sun, he'd taken those 2 Mexican kids out of the truck, and he'd shot them both in the head. Vincent was probably a head and shoulder taller than TJ and almost twice as heavy too. But after what he did, shooting those 2 kids, TJ went at him like a monster. Vincent had to point his pistol just to get him to back off, but TJ lost his vertical and was yelling, "Why? Why? What'd they do to you, huh? What'd they do?" And Vincent started saying how the cartel could be on our asses if they talked, but this was after telling us about the war between the cartels and how they'd never know it was us. I still don't know for sure if that was really all nonsense or if he just switched his plan up at the last minute, but those kids, man, they didn't have to die. Only one person had to die down at that dirt road in Mexico, and it sure as hell wasn't those kids. And when Vincent finished giving his little speech on how this was just too much money at stake to take any chances, he turned his back on TJ to go grab one of the bags. TJ then pulled his pistol and shot Vincent about 4 or 5 times in the back, and he hit the dirt, gasping for air. Then walked over to him. TJ put him down with 1 shot to the head. Me and Jody didn't freak out, not like we'd done when we saw those kids lying there with the dirt soaking up their brains. What TJ did felt natural, almost. No one questioned him. We just grabbed all the cash we could carry, loaded it into the truck, and then took off back towards the border. We didn't celebrate the money. We couldn't. Even when we got someplace safe and realized our shares tallied up to just under $1 million each, we were too exhausted to do anything but sit quietly with a few beers and wonder how the hell it all went so wrong. Those kids weren't like 12 or 13. They were small. Too small to even talk, I really think, and they wouldn't have been able to tell us 4 gringos apart from the boys in ZZ Top. So why'd Vincent kill them? I remember asking that question out loud, but TJ'd had enough, and after stomping out a cigarette, he told me it didn't matter, because that son of a bitch was dead. And then off he went to pack his share of the money. Now, once we were all packed up and we agreed to lay low for a while, Jody went to stay with his parents in Oklahoma while TJ took an extended vacation in New Orleans, and I went to stay with a girl that I'd been seeing for what amounted to a very low-key retirement party. I didn't tell her about Vincent or the kids, I just said I was done. Now, she'd always wanted me to walk the line and get a real job, so the news was music to my ears, and she told me to stay as long as I needed, and then maybe 3 weeks later, TJ showed up again driving a new Dodge. Now, it wasn't new, but we couldn't exactly go driving around in the same truck we used for the robbery, so it was a practical purchase. We went for a drive and caught up on things, and then TJ asked if I wanted to go get a burger or something later. I said sure, and we arranged for me to stop by his place around 7. Now, it felt like we were starting fresh. We wouldn't have to look over our shoulder anymore. Work wasn't a topic of conversation we'd ever really have to touch on again, and we'd had more money than we could ever spend without pissing it away. It felt like we could just stop surviving and start living, and it was strange to find myself grinning like a mule eating cockleburrs over nothing but a burger with an old buddy. He dropped me back off at my place, and then after a few hours of chilling with my girl, I drove over to TJ's place and knocked on the door. And that Dodge was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. It was almost exactly 7, and he wasn't the kind of guy to flake on plans like that, and so assuming he was probably just running late and was in the shower or something, I walked around to the yard and tried the back door. TJ never locked his back door, ever. He always left it open in case we needed a place to crash, and he also wasn't keeping his share of the money there either, so right away I knew something was off. I'd crashed there a bunch before, so I knew that there was a way to jimmy open a window or the first floor, but after getting it open and climbing inside, I felt my stomach drop. And that old cliche about the smell of blood, how it sort of hangs in the air, very heavy in places where a lot of it's been spilled, it's as true as steel, especially on a warm Texas evening. And the smell of blood in TJ's house was so strong I felt this shiver run up my spine as I realized something really, really bad had gone down. And as I ran through the house, I started yelling out his name and asking where he was. I found him in the upstairs bathroom, curled up in the tub, and he wasn't just dead. It looked like someone had tried to take him apart. I didn't look for long. I couldn't. But from what little I saw, he had his fingers missing, part of his face was gone, and someone had carved off a big patch of skin away from his side, so much so that I could see a couple of his ribs peeking through. That's the snapshot I can't ever get out of my head, even though I must have looked for no more than a second. I didn't stay long. I just slipped out the way I came in, ran back to my truck, and drove straight over to Jody's place to tell him what I'd found. Someone had come looking for us. We knew that much, and we agreed the best thing to do in the meantime was hide out someplace. Jody said he could find us a place in Oklahoma, somewhere real quiet and out of the way, but we still needed to square some stuff away at home first. We needed to get the money, and we warned folks who needed warning. Then, we could meet at a motel just outside of town and drive to Oklahoma from there. Now, it sounded like a smart enough plan. Have a base of operations just outside of town for a few hours, and then be gone by the evening. But after driving all over town and making sure my girl got herself to her mom's, I arrived at the motel to feel my stomach drop a second time. There were cops outside the room Jody said he'd be in, and police tape across the open door. There were EMTs too, and I didn't see them walking around, but their ambulance was there, and it was all I needed to see to know that they'd gotten Jody too. I left town right away, tail between my legs, but with the money sitting in the trunk of my car. I planned on going back. I still got family down in Texas, but once I got to Oklahoma and found a motel, I saw a news report on TV. It was about Jody, but it wasn't just hearing about his murder that scared me so bad. It was the description a witness had given the police, which became the basis for their person of interest appeal. But it was that which made me feel like the devil himself was standing right there next to me, laughing his ass off at a joke I didn't get. Because when the newscaster read out the man's description, being that of a tall, stocky man with long hair and a wild-looking beard, It sounded almost exactly like Vincent. Someone matching that description had been seen in the motel's parking lot acting strange. Then around the same time as the murders, this same person was said to have hopped in a truck and driven away from the scene at some very serious speed. But then, Vincent wasn't the only guy in Texas to have a long-ass beard and a ponytail, so that all could have been a coincidence, right? But then what are the chances of the same person sporting an oversized hat and a bunch of bandages around his head? I had never been so freaked out in my whole life, and I'd never been in a situation where I actually considered pinching myself because I was half convinced that I'd wake up to discover that the whole thing was just some horrible nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and I found myself faced with a very real possibility that Vincent had somehow survived TJ's attempt to kill him and had come to get his revenge. Looking back on it, I realized that it was much more likely to be the cartel and that somehow they figured out a way to track us down. But just the thought of some half-dead Vincent walking around looking like he'd crawled out of a grave, it sent shivers up my spine even all these years later. I live someplace else now, just about as far from Texas as it's possible to get without having to learn another language. So let's just say that whatever people speak here is sure as hell ain't Spanish. My name's Charlene, and I'm from Austin here in Texas, and I think I got a story that you might be interested in. It's one I've followed for the past 34 years now, and as of September of last year, it might finally have come to an end. But don't just take it from me. You can come to your own conclusions as I tell you, from my own perspective, about the yogurt shop murders. So in December of 1991, I was working at a store with a little strip mall in North Austin, and I had to open up the store on a Saturday morning. We were just down the strip from a branch of I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, a place that I used to stop by sometimes whenever the heat got a little too much. Now, mornings were usually nice and quiet, even on a Saturday, but on that morning, I noticed a whole bunch of police standing outside the yogurt shop. I knew not to be nosy, but I couldn't help but ask if everything was all right, as smoky black stains suggested some kind of fire. One officer told me it was fine and that I should just go about my business. Now, he said it in a friendly voice, but a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The police were still standing outside the yogurt shop when I clocked out and began making my way home. Only that time, there were men in shirts and ties standing with them, talking and taking notes. I caught a ride home with a friend, got to work on making dinner, and then later on while watching the evening news, I got a new report on what had happened at the yogurt shop, and I don't think that I'd ever been so horrified in my entire life. The newsreader described how, just the previous night, a fire had been reported at the yogurt shop. That didn't really come as a surprise, as I'd already seen the scorch marks and the soot. But the newsreader went on to say that after putting the fire out, firefighters were horrified to discover the naked, lifeless bodies of 4 young women. On the shop floor, a 15-year-old girl named Sarah Harbison lay dead on the tiles. Her body was joined by those of 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and Sarah's 17-year-old sister, Jennifer Harbison. All 3 had been shot in the head after being stripped and gagged with their own underwear. And then, thanks to the fire that had no doubt been started by their killer, each of the girls had extensive burns all over their bodies. In the back of the store, police found the body of a 13-year-old girl named Amy Ayers. Her burns weren't as bad as the other girls, but she'd been shot, execution style, same as the other girls. And the whole of Austin was shocked to its core by what had happened, and there were all kinds of tributes and vigils and whatnot so people could mourn the girls' passing and console their families. But once all that sadness was gone, once all the tears had been cried, it was replaced by this sense of anger and fury toward whoever had taken the girls' lives. It was so bad that a couple of days later, when some teenager was found carrying the same kind of gun as was used in the murders, everyone was convinced the cops had found the guilty party. I think 100 years prior, and they'd have broke into the county jail and lynched that poor kid. And I say poor kid because he was innocent of the murders and tried lying his way out of trouble because he was scared to catch a gun charge. But then once the police rolled him out as a suspect, there was this shared sense of frustration, like it was back to the drawing board, as it were. And we all hoped a new suspect would be found, and soon, but we had to wait years for any developments to this investigation, and when they arrived, it made no sense at all. When a new detective took over the case, he decided that the most likely suspects were actually the poor teenager I mentioned, along with 3 of his friends. You see, when they were first picked up, the cops were so convinced of their innocence that no record was made of what was said during their interviews, but that meant that this new lead detective wanted to interview them all over again. And the entirety of Austin was confused as hell because if these kids, who were by then in their 20s, had already been cleared, then why the heck were they being interviewed all over again? Now, we thought that it was some big waste of time and that the real killer was still out there, so imagine our shock when 2 of the boys, Rob Springsteen and Mike Scott, confessed to the murders during the second round of interviews. They went to trial and were convicted of capital murder, and both ended up receiving life in prison. We thought that was the end to the story, that those poor girls' killers had been found and that they were where they belonged. But then in 2008, we got another shocker when the Court of Appeals overturned both boys' convictions on account of improper procedure. It was a shocker, all right, but we still felt trapped in that same terrible spiral, if that makes sense, because the state announced that they were seeking a retrial. I felt like tearing my damned hair out when I heard the news, but then came the DNA announcement, because after all the analysis of all the samples, there was no evidence whatsoever that any of the 4 boys had anything to do with the yogurt shop murders. And after that, it was that same back to square one feeling, but it was much less hopeful. Almost 20 years had come and gone. The trails had no doubt gone cold, and many of my friends and neighbors were resigned to the fact that the killer would never be caught. And maybe about a year later, one of the original suspects ended up getting shot to death by police after a traffic stop went horribly wrong. Maurice Pierce, who didn't go to trial and wasn't sent to prison, ended up stabbing a police officer in the neck during a traffic stop. Another shocker, only a really nasty one that time. The officer almost died, and it got us all wondering if there had been some kind of mistake with the DNA testing. I mean, the guy tried to murder a cop by stabbing him in the neck, so even if he wasn't proven guilty, he sure as hell didn't seem innocent, you know? Now, we had to wait another 11 years for another development, by which time we'd next to given up on the yogurt shop killer ever being caught. And it made me sick to think that he was out there, walking free after doing such a terrible, evil thing. But then, in December of 2021, we got one heck of an early Christmas present when the yogurt shop case was once again reopened. Advanced DNA techniques were going to be used, meaning that even though so much time had passed, we were closer than ever to finding out who did it, because as I might have said, the cops had a DNA sample from someone they believed was the killer, and it was simply a case of finding a match. Now, even more resources were dedicated to the case in 2022 and 2023, which had us all praying that the murders would be solved once and for all. And then finally, in September of last year, so 2025, Austin police announced that they'd solved the case. After running DNA samples alongside the one from the yogurt shop, they realized that it was a near-perfect match for a man named Robert Brashers. Brashers was a serial killer who had been previously linked to the yogurt shop murders by DNA, and as early as 2018 if memory serves. But without the proper technology, police couldn't put it beyond reasonable doubt until just months ago. It was nice to finally know who was responsible, but it hurt knowing justice would never be truly served, as Brashers took his own life during a shootout with police in 1999. After getting the DNA results, police managed to get a hold of the gun that he used during that shootout. They test-fired it and then compared the bullet casing to one found at the yogurt shop crime scene, and it was an exact match. The news marked the end of a long, painful, and frightening story in the history of this town, one we could finally put to bed. But for some of us, who've been forever affected by what happened to those poor teenage girls, it's not over. And I recently read that under Texas law, if someone is imprisoned and later the conviction not only gets overturned, but the person is also declared innocent, they get up to $80,000 for each year they were wrongfully imprisoned. The article I read had a quote from lawyers of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. They said that they were hopeful that they'd receive the proper amount in restitution. But for me, it's that hope. That's all we can ever really hold on to. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear them on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, wear your fossil poop for Grandpa.